have you guys here today. Denise, while I am starting the introduction, are you okay with letting everybody in, admitting them? Awesome. All right, just want to do a couple of reminders before we get started and have Wes speak today about an exciting topic with diversity and inclusion. So thank you for everybody attending. I want to remind you that we do record these sessions and we do stick it up on a YouTube channel. So if you don't want to be recorded, you can take your picture off. If you're okay with being recorded, I ask that you keep the video on as we start to have discussion after Wes gets done presenting. And then afterwards, we'll send you guys an email that has that YouTube channel so you can see any of the roundtables that we've had in the past. The other thing I'll ask is that if everybody can stay muted while Wes is presenting, and we can unmute ourselves if you guys want to start having discussion when he's done presenting. In the meantime, if you think of questions along the way, as Wes is showing some content, feel free to write in the chat box and we can go over your questions once he's done. All right, and if there's no questions about anything, I'm going to turn it over to our speaker, Wes Becton, to talk about unleashing the growth of inclusion and innovation with our leaders.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. And Dan, thank you for making the connection. I'm really looking forward to this talk because it's about a topic that's complicated, uncomfortable, but it's also one that's not going away. So I thought that the best way to start, since we're talking about a complicated topic, is to look at a pretty picture. And so if we're going to, and let's see if my screen's going to cooperate here. Okay, so here's a pretty picture. What I'd like you to do is just for a couple seconds, take note of everything you see in the picture that's blue. Just take note of it. Everything you see in the picture that's blue. Give it a few more seconds. Okay, great. Now, if you've got a piece of paper, I'd like you to write down everything you saw that was yellow. And just looking at some of the reactions on the screen, you're like, wait a minute, you told us to take note of what was blue. Now you're asking to write down what's yellow. You may not have even realized that there was anything yellow in the picture. Well, that's because I tricked you. I said, hey, this is what I want you to do. And that's kind of the way life can work sometimes. We all have lenses and filters that we use to view the rest of the world through. And it's true about absolutely everything. I'm going to show you another picture. And again, I want you to take note of what you see here. So the picture on the left is a guy in a hoodie. The picture on the right is a guy in a uniform. And so as we're talking about the issue of race, what sort of thoughts come to mind when you see the picture on the left? I've done this a couple of times and my kids all say, oh, it's an old guy. Well, it's me. But if all of your life experiences have told you that people that look like me wearing a hoodie are a threat, well, then that could be the lens that you're viewing the world through. And once you can identify that lens, you can change it. And so if you look at the picture on the right, again, may have some different reactions. Same person about 27 years ago, but you're looking at a picture of a guy wearing a uniform. And you know what, in some parts of the world, believe it or not, that uniform could be considered offensive because maybe we've invaded or occupied your country. Maybe it gives you a feeling of patriotism and apple pie and baseball and all that good stuff. Or, you know what, maybe if you served in the military, you're going to see that here's a guy that was an infantry officer that jumped out of airplanes, that repelled out of helicopters, has a Ranger tab, and at some point was in the Army ceremonial unit in Washington, D.C. And again, it's all based on our level of consciousness and our life experiences. So we're going to jump into a quote, and I love this quote, and I'll summarize it like this. On screen you can read it, but you know what, if you take a really complicated idea and you try to explain it to somebody that's not very smart, there's a chance they may eventually understand it if they haven't already made up their mind about the topic. But let's say you got a really, really, really simple idea and you're trying to explain to somebody who's really, 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 really bright. there's no chance they're going to understand it if they've already made up their mind about it. And this is by Tolstoy. And what I'd ask you to do is, we're going through the content of this presentation, keep an open mind. And when you have a reaction to something, just take note of it. And then some of the hard work becomes figuring out where that thought came from and whether or not that thought is really true. So dealing with a group of human resource professionals, I'm sure you're all familiar with implicit bias assessments, but I left a link on the bottom of this for a series of assessments that have been put together by Harvard. They're free, you can take them, but at the end of the day, they all sort of say the same thing. And what they generally say is that people prefer to be around other people who are like them. So again, don't want to ruin it for you, but if you take it, that's generally what's going to be said. But this idea of like us, like them, what does that mean? And it can really mean a whole lot of different things. You know, is it talking about personality? Is it talking about whether or not someone is extroverted or introverted? Is it talking about behavior? Is somebody a people-oriented person, or are they a task-oriented person? Is it talking about sports? You know, are you a Cubs fan or are you a Sox fan? But ironically, at the end of the day, we're probably all Bears fans and Blackhawks fans. So why is that? Or, oh my gosh, if you haven't heard, there's going to be an election coming up in a few months. And guess what? There's some strong opinions around that. And we tend to gravitate towards people that may have the same political views as us. Maybe it's Democrat, Republican. You know, there's nothing inherently wrong in that. But the question becomes, why is this issue of race such a big deal? And I just want to spend a couple minutes to go through this. And I've left a whole bunch of references down on the bottom, everything from the 1619 Project to a good friend of mine, Connie Mixon, who's a professor at now what's known as Elmhurst University, where I'm a trustee. She does a lot of work on the history of race in Chicago. Colin Powell wrote a fantastic book about his life. There's a book that my dad wrote that you can find called Autobiography of a Soldier and a Public Servant. And then there's a couple of YouTube interviews. But let's go back to 1619 when slaves from Africa were first introduced to the United States. It was done for some economic reasons. We were an agrarian society, and we needed a labor force. And at the time, it was thought this was a cheap labor source. Turned out not to be all that cheap, but that was the thought process back then. Slavery's abolished. You're a landowner in the South. You've got crops in the field. Oh my gosh, what are we going to do? We need some labor. Well, so what happened is you created this system where you're a former slave. I'm going to build you a house. I'm going to build you a community. I'm going to rent that community. I'm going to rent that house to you, and I'm going to pay you a salary. Now, the salary I'm going to pay you is less than your rent. And oh, by the way, if you don't do this, I'm going to figure out a way to get you arrested. That was some of the history in the country. And you get these ideas of black codes and indentured servitude. That's the history. And again, do the work yourself. Go and read it. Don't believe it just because I'm saying it. But then what happened was this whole idea of the Great Migration, where people said, hey, this doesn't make sense. We're going to move up to the north because our country was changing from an agrarian society to an industrial society. And some great cities like Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit had jobs that people moved north to fill. And you know what? Around that time, there were some really affluent black communities that developed. And literally with a stroke of the pen in 1914, segregation wasn't legal, wasn't necessarily the law then, but 1914, President Woodrow Wilson signed an executive order segregating the federal workforce, meaning, hey, if you were a black person, if you're a white person, these were the jobs that you could have. And that led to Jim Crow laws, legalized segregation. That was the law of the land until 1964. So literally, you can go and look at some of the issues that we've got in our urban environments and other parts of the country, and trace those back to a question that was never answered in the Constitution. And you can look to see how some of these problems continue to be perpetuated. For those of you that are in real estate, talk about redlining, and again, it just goes on and on and on. But you know what? It becomes this complicated topic, so complicated, in fact, that people are even uncomfortable talking about it. But guess what? When the issues surrounding George Floyd's murder happened, I remember the day that the video surfaced. I was sitting out on my deck wearing a black tank top, and I looked at the video, and everybody that saw that video thought it was horrific. There's no one that could look at that and think that it wasn't horrific. But people of color probably looked at that video a little bit differently. I looked at it and said, you know what? That could have been me. That could have been my 24-year-old son, could have been my 20-year-old son, could have been my 94-year-old dad who fought in 3 wars in a segregated army in World War II and the start of the Korean War. And so, if you've got employees of color and they're part of your organization, those employees are friends, and you don't ask them how they're doing, they're going to come up with a narrative as to the reason why you're not asking that question. And that narrative probably is not going to be favorable to you or to the organization. They're going to make, and whenever there's a void or there's a vacuum of information, you can see it in other areas too. Wow, it's amazing. And you all are HR professionals. It's amazing the stories that people can tell themselves as to the reasons why these things are happening or not happening. But if you could create a way to protect your organization, not just against this issue, but against other issues that are going to happen, wouldn't you want to take advantage of it? And really, it's so simple. And I'm an executive leadership coach. I spend most of my time working with business owners and leaders about how to show up as the very best version of themselves. And so many people have a hard time it's 4 words. It's 4 words. How are you doing? And then shut up. And if the other person is not ready to talk about it, that's okay. That's not on you. But guess what? You filled that void with something, and you're going to minimize the chances that they're going to just think you don't care, or worse. But when you ask them how they're doing and they're not ready to talk, maybe at some point they will be, but you've done your part. But let's say they are ready to talk. People get scared. What do I say then? What do I do? Well, there's some great training, Crucial Conversations training, highly recommended. And it says a few things. The first thing is keep the conversation safe. Again, if they're not ready to talk about it, don't force the issue. Take all judgment out of it. Judgment of yourself, judgment of them, thinking that you know more than the other person or the other person knows more than you. Start with the facts. Emotions that usually drive arguments usually come when you're away from the facts and you're talking about opinion. If you stick to the facts, the emotions tend to stay out of it. And those emotions sometimes are the things that can get you in trouble if they aren't in check. Be curious. I can say this because she's not listening right now, but my wife is great at this because she's somewhat nosy. She just loves to ask people questions. She can say some things that I'm like, oh my gosh, how did you say that? Or how could you possibly ask that? But other people receive it well because she's doing it from a place of curiosity, no judgment. And again, don't assume that you know the answers. If you can do those things, you can move the needle, and you can take that void or that vacuum and you can turn it into something that actually will measurably increase employee engagement and retention. Because if you don't, that story that people are telling themselves about you and the organization it's going to lead to disengagement, and it could lead to increased turnover, which I know is a concern for everybody. So here's one of the connections. So why is this important? So my daughter and her husband went to the University of Missouri. I spent a lot of tuition dollars at the University of Missouri. I've got Mizzou gear. I've got t-shirts, sweatshirts, hats, you name it. I even had a bumper sticker at one point. So I like Mizzou. My daughter and her husband and our granddaughter, they still live down there. But Mizzou put this ad out last year. And I just want to let you look at it. And they took it down 25 minutes after it was pulled out. And you can Google this. If you're subscribed to the Chronicle of Higher Education, there was a whole series of articles about this ad. So why is this important? Well, let's look at this ad. You could look at it and say, I don't see anything wrong with it. Okay, but let's just think through this for a minute. You've got two people who are not people of color, and they're a future doctor and they're a future corporate financier. That's great. That's aspirational. You've got two people of color, and what it says is, yep, I'm an African-American woman and I value equality. If a person of color had been involved in the approval process for this ad, I'm pretty sure that that ad wouldn't have gone out. Or let's say it wasn't a person of color, someone who had a lens that could look at this ad and say, you know what, we may want to look at this from someone else's perspective. That becomes a value to the organization. And I just want to let that sit for a second. And as you think about your organizations, why is diversity and inclusion important? Well, because you've got either vendors, customers, employees, stakeholders, shareholders, somebody that would be offended by this. And if you can avoid that, wow, you've just added value to what your organization is trying to do. I want to tell a story. Katie, how am I doing on time? Am I doing all right on time? Okay, good. So I mentioned earlier that I'm a member of the board of trustees at Elmhurst University. We just changed the name July 1st, so it's still sounds a little bit weird saying Elmhurst University. But the guy you're looking at, his name's Abner Organic. Abner and I got to know each other when he was a volunteer at a surgery center where I was the executive director. And Abner was the former mayor of Elmhurst, and he was literally one of my best friends. Lost him 7 years ago. But I'm telling you this because on the surface of things, he and I have nothing in common. Here's a man who fought in World War II. Here's a guy who is Jewish. Here's a guy who, again, different race. We don't, on the surface, we don't have a lot in common. But when he'd come in the office to volunteer on Tuesdays, literally we'd sit down and we've had conversations about what it was like for him growing up as a young Jewish kid on the west side of Chicago. And what it was like being chased home by bullies who didn't think that a Jewish kid should be allowed to live or pass through their neighborhood. And sometimes I equate racism to bullying. It's not exactly the same thing, but I want to go back just for a minute to that George Floyd incident. So, if I were to ask show of hands how many people have ever been bullied, maybe some people would raise their hands. How many people have ever seen somebody get bullied? Maybe some more people would raise their hands. And if I asked if anybody's ever bullied anybody, hopefully no one's gonna raise their hand. But this idea of bullying and seeing somebody get bullied and not doing something about it, go back to the George Floyd incident and think about those three other officers that were watching what happened but didn't do anything, didn't say anything. They're complicit in what happened. And you know what, unless people of courage are willing to stand up and speak up and say something, these issues aren't going to go away. And, when I'm in the conversation, usually they're in bounds. But what happens when a person of color is not in that conversation. You're sitting around and people were saying things that are off color that crosses that boundary. Are you going to have the courage to stand up and say something? That leads me into my buddy Abner. Abner was, as a trustee at Elmhurst, was asked to escort a speaker around campus. This is probably close to 20 years ago. Speaker's name was Elie Wiesel, Nobel Prize winner, has written a number of fantastic books. But Abner's escorting him around Elmhurst College campus. They sit down on a bench under a tree, and every time I tell the story, I still get some goosebumps. But Abner and Elie Wiesel are talking, and Elie Wiesel asks Abner, "What did you do during the war?" Abner said, "I can't talk about it. It's too difficult." Elie Wiesel, kept prodding and said, "Well, listen, this is what happened. I enlisted in the Army. I fought in the 1st Infantry Division. I fought my way across Europe, and I ended up liberating the Buchenwald death camp." And Elie Wiesel stops him and says, "What day was that?" Abner gave him the exact date, time, day of the week, and Elie Wiesel stops him and says, "You saved my life. I was supposed to be executed the next day." And Elie Wiesel went on to say, "Abner, you've got to tell this story, because if you don't tell this story, the same thing could happen again." So from that point on, Abner made it his mission to travel to middle schools, high schools, civic organizations, churches, synagogues, mosques, telling his story. And towards the end, I was driving him around to do a lot of these talks. And, he always left the audience with two things. One is this idea of man's inhumanity to man, man's ability to be cruel to one another, not just with actions and murdering people like we saw in like what happened during the Holocaust, what happened with Mr. Floyd, but sometimes just saying things that are hurtful. So man's inhumanity to man. The other thing he talked about was this idea of the consequences of being indifferent. What we talked about just a minute ago, seeing a wrong and not doing anything about it. And, the title of today's talk is having a conversation. And what I hope happens is that this has changed your lens just a little bit to maybe help you see things a little bit differently, and to give you the permission and the authority to be able to have those difficult conversations, and to call, especially for organizations that have a statement on equal opportunity or have a value statement that talks about valuing diversity, having the courage to speak up and say something. So Katie, I can stop right here. I do have one more story that I can share, but I just wanted to take a break and see if there were any questions or comments up to this point.
So we have no questions or comments right now. So Wes, if you want to tell the last story that you have, and then we can open it up for the last half an hour to build some discussion.
Okay. Well, I'm going to warn you, this next one's a little bit controversial. So if the chat room starts sparking and people start throwing things, I apologize in advance. But here's the story. So my oldest son, who's 24, works for a consulting company, management consulting company in Washington, D.C. But he went to Middlebury College in Middlebury, Vermont, played college football. This last year, we went to every football game. Literally, we traveled from Chicago to Vermont, Maine, Massachusetts every week for 9 weeks to go to football games. But before every home game, there was a tailgate. And at this particular game, this is back in 2017, I met the guy on the right. His name is Pete. Pete's grandson played on the team. We had a nice conversation before the beginning of the game, just got to know him a little bit. And on the left, this is Mame. Mame's nephew was the quarterback on the team. Mame is a special education teacher in Vermont, just a really solid-earth person. Got to know her over the 4 years that our son was there. So anyway, we go into the game, national anthem starts, two of the Middlebury football players take a knee, and this guy, Pete, who's from California, starts yelling at the top of his lungs. He says, stand up, stand up. Well, Mame, this picture was taken afterwards, and it'll make sense in just a minute. But Mame, who's never met Pete before, is in front of him, and Mame turns around and says, "Shut up." And Pete says, "You shut up." And then it's on, and some expletives start flying, and the national anthem is going, and a bunch of us start singing a little bit louder. I'm about 20 seats from this, and finally the national anthem ends and the game starts. But then halftime comes, and Pete's sitting there by himself. And so there was just this thing inside me that said, you know what? I feel obligated to say something, but I'm not sure what to say, because I had some information that Pete didn't have. So I go over, I sit down to him, like, "Hey, Pete, Wes, we met before the game, and you know what? I think I told you that I served in the military, but I don't think I told you my dad served in the military, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, retired as a 3-star general, fought in the segregated unit. He's going to be at the game next week. And, you know, if his grandson had taken a knee, my 94-year-old father would have walked down with his cane, hobbled down, and he would have whacked him in the knee with his cane. But in the same breath, he would have said, you know what, I fought in those 3 wars so that you could have the right to do it, just not my grandson. So I said, "Pete, do you know why those 2 players were taking a knee?" And Pete goes on to say, "Oh, they're thugs, they're un-American, they're unpatriotic, they're just," this vitriol starts coming out. And I said, "Well, Pete, you know, hey, you know, obviously you're quite passionate about this issue, but, you know, I talked to the coach before the game, and I know the reason why those players were taking a knee. The coach knows the reason why the players taking a knee. There's been 3 racial incidents on Middlebury's college campus before that game in 2017. And Pete says, racial incidents? Now it's 2017. How is that even possible? I can't believe that. I'm like, yeah. So the kids aren't thugs or whatever. These are great kids, great students, great athletes, great people. And I said, that's why they're doing it. He's like, oh my gosh, that's terrible. So I tell you what, Pete, you know what, after the game, a bunch of us dads, we get together and we have a little toast after the game, drink a little scotch, and why don't you come join us? So Pete says, sure. So I go to Mame right here. She bakes a pie, a big sheet pie, before every game. And I said, hey, Mame, you know that guy behind you? Like, yeah, and some expletives start coming out of her mouth that I won't repeat. But I said, Mame, why don't you go give Pete a piece of pie? And she's like, no. She's like, ain't doing it, not happening. So I talked to her again. I said, you know, you two probably have a lot in common. I just talked to him. So anyway, make a long story short, this is a picture of Mame giving Pete a piece of pie, Pete drinking a glass of scotch, and them having a conversation where they actually did realize that they had a lot in common. So why am I bringing this up? You know, civics. If you're of a certain age, you probably took civics classes in school. They don't necessarily teach it as civics anymore, but civics is about being a citizen, about being a participant in the governmental process. And I think, and again, this is my opinion, other people obviously have different opinions, but I think if we understand the reasons why things are happening, we can make more informed decisions. So, you know, again, this is the controversial part because people have strong emotions about this. But, you know, players taking a knee is not about them being unpatriotic, at least when it started. It was about them bringing attention to an issue of police violence against young Black men. That's how it started. It got conflated into some other things, which again are not what we're talking about today. But if you go back to that issue and the core issue, we have to always be vigilant to make sure that we're informing ourselves, because that's what civics talks about. It's an informed citizenry, because being an American requires being informed about what's going on, doing our best to get the most accurate information. So, Katie, if I didn't stir the pot enough with that, I'm not sure what else to do, but there you go. I wanted to stop there and see if there are any questions.
You didn't stir the pot enough.
I got some other ones too.
What questions do you guys have for Wes?
Hey, Wes, my name is Tom Kennedy, and I have a question for you.
Sure.
And I guess the bottom line is, how do we impact change within corporations? And as you were speaking, especially in that last story, I reflected on in the late 60s, during the unrest, there was an expression, America, love it or leave it. And we added to that the expression, America, love it, leave it, or fix it.
Yeah.
Likewise, the discussion that you've just referenced, what are those things that can be done within a corporate setting where we can initiate a conversation? And generally, probably in the past, I would have said, leave it out of the corporate world unless it impacts what's best for your organization. However, today, with social media, one of my clients, they have a lot of tension right now because of people posting things on whatever website, Facebook, etc. And sometimes I question whether that's in their best interest, especially if they're officers of the company. But regardless, it has resulted in the need for a conversation. So I guess my question, Wes, is what can organizations do to address everything you've referenced today and to show that it's in their best interest, if you will, the bottom line of the organization?
Yeah, so that's a fantastic question, and it's one that I get a lot. And with a diverse group like this, I'll sort of frame it from a macro standpoint. So each organization, I'm assuming, has some sort of a mission, has some sort of a vision, and probably has a value statement. Okay. And so I'd ask you to go back and look at that value statement. And is it something that's in a drawer that gets pulled out when maybe you've got an accreditation or an audit or something like that? Or is it something that you test and you compare your actions to? And if it needs to be updated, then update it. But that value statement should give you a basis to have a starting point to have that conversation. If you've got a statement on equal opportunity for employment, you're kind of required to do that. But let's say you've got a statement on equal opportunity for vendors or for your customers. What sort of documents do you have, and how can that empower you as a leader or the organization in general to have some boundaries for those conversations? And then really, I don't want to be overly simplistic, but it's about having these conversations, and these one-off things where you do it and then nothing's done after. And I should have said this at the beginning, I am not a diversity and inclusion expert. That's not what I do. I'm a leadership coach, but I also believe that this is a leadership culture issue, in that if you have the right leadership principles in place, when this topic or the next topic or the next topic after that comes up, you'll have a format to be able to address it and deal with it. But it really starts with just that conversation. And something else that I reference, and I'll end there. I'm not sure if I answered the question, but it's having the courage to speak up when people go outside of that value statement or that equal opportunity statement. And not just the leaders being the police that are doing that, but every employee feeling empowered. Just like, in Six Sigma, if you see a safety violation, you want somebody to be able to pull the stop switch. You want somebody to feel empowered to speak up and say, hey, this doesn't line up with our values. So I rambled. Does that come anywhere near answering your question?
Yeah, you did not ramble at all. It was very helpful. I appreciate it. Thank you, Wes.
No problem. Thank you.
Wes, do you also think that we can start educating our employees, our leadership, about biases, microaggression, and kind of start building that baseline? A lot of people say they don't even know what diversity and inclusion even means when we bring that up in a conversation.
Yeah, I can give you a real fun way to do this in your organizations. And I sort of did it in that slide that talks about things people like. But if you were to come up with maybe 6 sets of pairs, so I prefer oceans or mountains, or I prefer summer or winter, I prefer Cubs or Sox, and it can be any sort of pairs. And then everybody has to pick one. And then your organization, that group, they have to find somebody that has the exact same match that they do, like the exact same choices they do. And what inevitably will happen is you'll find some clusters of people, but then there'll be somebody that's sitting there all by themselves. And they're going to start to feel like, wait a minute, what's wrong with me? No one's thinking like me. And that is a great icebreaker to lead into this discussion. Like, so how did that make you feel, to feel like you're the only one and nobody else felt like you? And they'll tell you, yeah, if you've ever been the only one of anything in a group or one of a few, it can be very uncomfortable. And guess what happens psychologically? If you're spending time thinking about why everybody doesn't like me or why I'm the only one, that's taking away from your ability to be productive. So you want to tie back to the bottom line. You want all of that energy engaged in the present moment, not worrying, not being fearful, not doubting, not wondering whether or not people give a crap about me. All of that, and that's a whole nother talk, but all of that is taking your energy away from being present in the moment and being fully engaged. And again, there's more to it than that, but did that come anywhere near answering your question? Okay, thank you. Thank you for making me feel better.
I have a question.
Sure.
Hi Wes, I'm Ashley, and I am usually like a pretty optimistic, glass half full type of person, and try to, live my day and interact with people that way. And, this year has been hard for many reasons, especially with what happened after George Floyd's murder. And of course, so I've been talking and having conversations with friends, mainly more friends, as opposed to business, at least at this point in time. But how would you, rate or rank, or like, there's a saying that you have to kind of like fall apart before you can like rebuild. And I can resonate with that. Like we're definitely like, we've fallen apart, right? But do you feel like we're starting to make a positive change? And do you feel that there's a movement happening? And are you optimistic? Because I hope you say yes, but I don't know. Are we getting better?
Yeah. Boy, that's a big question. And if I don't answer it, please get me back on topic. But last week, my wife and I had a consulting gig up in Minneapolis, in one of the suburbs, and we drove by the location where Mr. Floyd was murdered. And you can't drive to the exact spot. They've got it blocked off, and it wasn't what I was expecting. It was actually a residential neighborhood, and it wasn't a bad neighborhood at all. But what's happened there is they built a memorial. It's a burgeoning memorial that's still being developed, and the neighbors are very protective of that. They're almost treating it like it's sacred ground. And what's happening in Minneapolis that isn't getting a lot of press is a lot of people and a lot of organizations are coming together to say, hey, we can be better than this, and what's next. Now, if you drive through parts of the city, there's still boarded up buildings, and it's a little bit creepy. But that gives me hope. And again, this is not a political statement, but if you watch enough of the news, you can be convinced that sharks are going to start swimming through cornfields pretty soon. I mean, there's just a lot of nutty stuff that's out there. But in reality, what I saw with my own eyes is a community that's healing and coming to grips with something that's very uncomfortable. Again, just not stepping on toes. But I went to a rally here in the suburb where I live, and it was very inspiring. But there were some things that were said that I didn't agree with, because I didn't understand them. I come from a military background, and when somebody says, "Hey, defund the police," it didn't resonate with me. So I couldn't. There was a chant like, "Hey, defund the police." I couldn't say it because I didn't understand it. But kind of like we're talking about that lens and doing the work, the more I understand it, like I still don't agree with everything, but there's some components of that make total sense. And again, that's part of that lens that I'm choosing to look at it through. So one more story, and hopefully this will give you some encouragement that yes, I am optimistic about the future. So my dad, who's my hero, who's 94, enlisted in a segregated army in World War II. That meant when he fought in the Philippines, his unit was all black. They had some white officers, but it was all black. Same thing in Korea. At the beginning of the Korean War, he deployed with an all-black unit. Halfway through the Korean War, President Truman desegregated the military, and he did it not because of social reasons or because he felt like it was the right thing. He did it because we were getting our butts kicked. Literally, we got pushed back to the Pusan perimeter and on the southern tip of the Korean Peninsula, and we had to send replacements in, and we couldn't take the time to figure out whether, hey, you're black, you go here, you're white, you go there. No, so they put them together for the first time. They fought, and they fought effectively because, quite frankly, the stereotype was that black Americans would not fight. And so they were typically doing, stuff behind the lines, but they figured out that they could fight and fight effectively. So the same guy, my dad, he's 94, who enlisted in a segregated unit, World War II, fought eventually an integrated unit in Korea, commanded a Cav squadron in Vietnam, eventually retired as a 3-star general, and commanded over 100,000 soldiers and family members in Germany in the late 70s. I mean, come on, that's progress. That's huge. That gives me hope, and that's something that I've seen with my own eyes. So yeah, I think as long as these conversations are happening, and again, I don't want to give anybody indigestion, but as long as people of courage are standing up and saying, "Hey, that's not right," yeah, it will change. But if it's this, I did this talk for a men's group here in the town where I live, and at the end of it, somebody said, "Wes, I agree with everything you're saying. This isn't right, but you know what? I've got family members and I've got friends that don't agree with me. Their minds aren't open to this, and if I say something, it could ruin that family relationship or those friendships, and I just don't know if I want to do that." And I said, "Well, hey, congratulations. That's fantastic self-awareness." And the bottom line is the answer to this question: how important is it to you? Because it becomes an equation. If it's important to you, you will speak up and say something. If it's not that important to you, you're probably not. But then it goes back to that whole idea of those other 3 police officers that watched Mr. Floyd get murdered. If you're not speaking up and not saying something, we may be complicit. So, Ashley, I told like 14 stories there, so if I apologize.
Hey, Wes, I have some questions in the chat box.
Sure.
Are there examples of organizations or corporations that are successfully changing their implicit biases within their culture that others can use as a model to follow?
Yeah, so I'm a little embarrassed because I used to teach organizational behavior as an adjunct at Lewis University. If there's any former students on here, I apologize. The stuff that I would reference, they're all going to be dated. So the short answer to the question is yes, there are companies that are doing it. And I'm just curious because I understand there's a mix of of companies here in size and missions. But, you know, in at least a couple of clients that I'm working with, they have a VP level diversity and inclusion specialist, sort of a chief diversity officer, and that person has people underneath them. Now, if any of you fit that role, I'm gonna probably get something thrown at me, but I would say if you're an organization and you hire a chief diversity inclusion officer and that's all you give them to do, they may not be taken completely seriously. They've got to have a portfolio of other things that they do. And, you know, I think that those organizations are progressive, and they're not just doing one-offs, they're doing, it's woven into their culture. What I like to use is the ethics example. So you can teach a class on ethics, or you can have a program on ethics, but oh my gosh, wouldn't it be better if that was woven into everything that you do? Wouldn't you get more bang for your buck, and when people take it more seriously? Because again, if you've got annual training requirements and one module is on diversity inclusion, you know, they're just going through the motions sometimes. But if this idea of diversity and inclusion is woven into everything you do, and again, I'm going to stir the pot here a little bit, but you know, the vendors, the suppliers that you use, are they diverse? You know, the customers that you go after, what do they look like? And oh, by the way, what message are you sending to your employees? And so specific companies, I'd say anything I gave you wouldn't be current. I would say you could probably Google it, and it's the same companies that you would expect that are fairly progressive, that are doing it. Maybe there's someone on the call that's doing it. That'd be pretty cool.
We have another question. How do you diffuse emotion and opinion about race when having conversations in the workplace? You did a great job with your football story to find common ground, but how do we help ourselves and leaders do this better when many are full of opinion and emotion that prevents them from learning and seeking to understand others?
Yeah, that is such a well-informed question. And the example I'll use is from an organization I did a similar presentation with. It's a library, I'll just leave it at that. And at the end of the presentation, somebody gave me this scenario. They were at an information desk. A customer came up and said, hey, I need some help with IT, with some connectivity. And the person that was available to help was a person of color. And this person was an older gentleman, not a person of color. The customer was that. And the customer said, I don't want that person to help me. And so the person said, yeah, I wasn't sure what to do. And I asked her, well, what did you do? And what she said is, well, you know, I went and helped him myself. I don't think the other person, the person of color, heard me. I said, all right, well, let's unpack that a little bit. And, you know, again, you could look at that and you could have a whole lot of judgment and say, hey, how come she didn't say something? But what I asked her in general was, all right, so put yourself in the shoes of that other person, that person of color that you're saying didn't hear, but probably did hear that conversation. How did that person feel? And then let's unpack a little bit more. What do your organizational policies say about how to handle that situation? You probably don't have a specific policy that says, hey, if a customer asks something that is racist, what are we supposed to do? Probably don't have a policy that says that, but oh my gosh, what you can do is go back to the crucial conversation stuff and clarify and ask the question. And you could, if you're like me, you want to have a little bit of fun with it, say, so can I be curious and ask you why you don't want this employee to help you? Make the person say it. Because again, at that point, you don't know. They're just saying, hey, I don't want that person to help me. Be curious, ask the question. If they blatantly say, I don't want that person because they're a person of color, well, then guess what? You go back to your organization's policies and procedures, and then those policies and procedures probably there's a value statement, as we talked about. It's probably an equal opportunity statement. There's probably an anti-harassment, whatever it is, whatever your organization has, you refer back, and that's what gives you the authority. But here's the rub. If you've got the policy, but it's not being enforced, what message is that sending to the other employees in the organization? And as a coach, I would ask the question, well, if you're enforcing that policy inconsistently, what other policies are you enforcing inconsistently? And guess what you've just done to that bar? You've just lowered it. And now people are saying, well, hey, we don't have to adhere to that policy. So, again, not sure if that was the answer you're looking for, but I think it comes back to, again, just understanding your policies, being curious, asking questions, and calling people out when they cross a line. Okay.
Wes, we cannot thank you enough for your time today. We really appreciate your stories that you were able to share with us. And I think that's what I just typed in the chat box, is that the storytelling that you did made such connections for people that might not be on the same side. And that's what builds opportunity to have those conversations that you're referring to. I appreciate your time spending the last hour with us. And actually, I'm going to turn it over to Phil, our president, to let you guys know about some future roundtables and some other announcements.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all